Well, revelations again of the 150 million rand digital vibes tender for COVID-19. This was in the Department of Health, has again reiterated the urgent need to end corruption, particularly where procurement is concerned. The public procurement bill was tabled in Parliament in February 2020. However, the proposed law has been plagued by never-ending delays. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Gio Kino, who is with the University of Stellenbosch's Public Procurement Law, and he's an expert in this field. Professor Kino, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. I think it's become common knowledge now that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way in which government procures its work. And, you know, most South Africans know it as the tendering system or people losing money to corruption through tenders. But ultimately, it really is about supply chain processes that are continuously being flouted, and somehow there's just no there's no implementation despite the legislation that already exists.
That's correct, yes. So you're absolutely correct. It's one of these strange areas where we've got a lot of law. There are many, many details, rules. This area of public administration is highly regulated, and yet, as you've noted, this is certainly one of the weakest of the weak links in our public administration. So it is, I think, now crystal clear that something is seriously amiss in this area of public administration.
But where do we begin to get it right? Because I'll bring in the issue of the bill that's before Parliament. But one would think that with the legislation that we have right now, and even some of the directives that flow from the National Treasury on how government entities and departments should be procuring work, that one would think that that would suffice in as far as protecting the public purse.
Yes, well, unfortunately, our legal system around public procurement is highly fragmented. So we don't have consolidated rules. The rules are spread out all over the place, and they're often vague. They're often not consistent with each other. And that makes for a very volatile regulatory space in which it's quite easy, actually, because there are so many rules to hide malfeasance. And that's why we so urgently need a consolidation of all the regulatory rules in this area so that it just becomes easier to see where things go wrong, so that we can pick up on red flags and immediately take action.
What difference would this bill make, Prof?
So, well, firstly, it's not yet in Parliament. So it's a draft bill. It's only been published for public comment, and we don't know when it's going to go to Parliament, which is part of the problem. It seems to be taking inordinately long to finalize this very urgent piece of law reform. But the big step it will take is it will bring all rules regarding public procurement for all levels of government under one umbrella regulatory regime, so that we can at long last consolidate all the rules. And then, you know, when we want to scrutinize individual transactions, at least we know where to start. What is the main legal instrument in terms of which it should be done? And hopefully it'll give us more streamlined, more clear, and more direct legal rules governing particular decisions in the procurement process.
With that said, are we not likely to see the continuation of the flouting of the legislation if part of what is happening is just to bring it under one umbrella and not necessarily deal with the gaps that already exist in the system? So if people are continuously flouting the PPMA, what is the recourse that should be in place to ensure that that doesn't happen, at least not at the rate that it does?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. So a law in itself is not going to make any difference. It's just a starting point. So on the back of that, we will have to take some very serious actions, and hopefully a new law will enable us to do that more effectively. The one thing is to do serious capacity building. We are seriously undercapacitated across a wide sector of people working in SCM, and we need to address that. But secondly, we need to do better in enforcement. So we need to be better in the rules we've got. One of the things that we've pointed out in a recent report we've done for Corruption Watch is that we've got a very effective mechanism of restricting suppliers from doing business with the state, and yet we don't see that mechanism being used. And we need to ask serious questions why that is the case. Why is that seemingly simple mechanism that should be effective not doing its work? And I think once we've got a consolidated set of rules, and most importantly, an entity that can actually oversee the implementation of those rules nationally and across all levels of government, we can start to ask those serious questions, and we can start to design interventions that can be tailored and focused on those areas where we see most abuse of the system.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, the issue of capacity is often spoken about in terms of the individuals who are running the administrative processes. Is it an issue of people not understanding how to apply some of these legal requirements, or is it that there has been, by and large, a deliberate flouting of these processes? Because at the end of the day, it's one of the ways to continue keeping corruption going, and those who are benefiting obviously don't want to stop benefiting.
Absolutely. And it's both, right? So it's not either or, it's both of those. And that's what makes it so difficult at the moment, because at the moment it's quite difficult to see where there's just a failure to completely understand, but still a good intentioned official, as opposed to a deliberate attempt to circumvent the system. And because our system is so fragmented and so difficult to distinguish between those instances, it becomes very difficult to enforce. And that makes for a very unfortunate scenario where corruption can then really become rife.
Accountability is also a big thing, Professor Kino, when it comes to the procurement space and being able to root out corruption. Will this piece of legislation make it easier to hold officials accountable and move away from the situation where we often see where there's a lot of scapegoating, and oftentimes it's the mid-level managers that have to take the fall for instructions that they were acting on from high above them?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is a critical part of the new legislation. We must absolutely see more effective mechanisms to deal with the entire value chain in terms of decision-making right up to the top. Crucially, also, we need to get higher levels of professionalization in our SCM, because we know that when you've got professionalization in a particular area, that professionalization on its own will create higher levels of integrity. Individuals will be less likely to act in abuse of the system if they fear that their professional standing will come into question. And if we can establish that, so if we can have a system where chief procurement officers, senior people taking decisions in SCM are affiliated with a professional body and they are reliant on that affiliation to continue with their careers, one would hope that you will get more consequence management and hence be able to deal with exactly the kind of thing that you are alluding to.
And with an idea like that, it's a fantastic idea, but where does one even begin with it in terms of trying to workshop it and make sure that it gains ground?
Well, I think it's actually not that difficult. I think it's simply a policy decision that needs to be taken right at the top. So I think National Treasury should simply, and government should simply decide that this is the way to go, and they should legislate for it. I think that's the starting point. Once you've written that into legislation, then one can bring the stakeholders to the table and say, look, now it's legislative, it's going to be a requirement, you have a phasing in period, and then you can create a body that can effectively do this. Hopingly, I think the best model would be to design partnerships, so partnerships between government on the one hand, academia, training institutions, but also the private sector that's playing in this field, that all the players can come together and take ownership of professional body. There are many countries in the world where this has been done very effectively, including on our own continent. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can simply look at these successful models and replicate it here. But it starts with a political will to bring something like this into place. Because as you've noted before, there's many vested interests that would like something like this not to gain ground, because it would be the end of lucrative careers in this. So it really starts with the political will to bring that to an end and introduce a new regime that can effectively deal with that part of SCM.
Professor of Law at Stellenbosch University and Public Law Procurement Expert, Professor Gio Kino, let me thank you for your time tonight.